Hi there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan, and I just can't get enough of all those little tidbits of cyberpunk lore we keep getting in the game. I mean, that's why I've played over like 60 hours and I haven't even finished the game. I keep stopping at like every data pad and reading everything I can get my hands onto. Now, we've talked a lot about what's been happening in Night City and the North American continent, and things aren't really looking all that great for the United States. But the reality is things are falling apart everywhere in the world. And so today I thought it'd be cool to take a trip to the beautiful country of true Korea and discuss what's going on in the Cyberpunk universe, because it's no longer North and South Korea. The peninsula is united. They say outsiders don't really understand the whole Korea dilemma. We see North Korea's totalitarian dictatorship as diametrically opposed to South Korea's free market-oriented democracy. We see the North Koreans as a strange group of people trapped in a past era, oppressed, impoverished, and isolated from the rest of the world. Completely the opposite of South Koreans, who are modern, fashionable, and very culturally relevant. To us, South Koreans and North Koreans couldn't be more different from one another. But despite all these differences, many Koreans, especially the older generation, still believe in unification and see the North Koreans as brethren rather than foreigners. In our current world, reunification seems very unlikely, and that's because new, young generations of South Koreans don't really support it. Young Koreans are more likely to view North Koreans as strange and as the enemy, whereas older generations still remember a time when Korea was whole and might even have family members or friends who are stuck on the other side of the DMZ. And as North and South Korea continue to grow apart both economically and culturally, the idea of unification is also slipping away. Well, at least in our timeline. So what happens in Cyberpunk's version of South Korea? Well, the first Korean War still happened and ends with the Korean Armistice Agreement. For the next half century, North Korea would continue to decline economically and South Korea would continue to grow and prosper. But then the stock market crash of '94 happened. This one singular moment keeps showing up in my research, and it seems like this is when the Cyberpunk universe diverges from ours. This was a massive economic collapse that makes the Great Depression and the Great Recession seem like minuscule affairs. The US dollar collapses, the World Bank and the IMF disappear, and US government bonds are being cashed in faster than the Fed can print new bills. Essentially, the global economy, which is based on the US dollar, collapses, and the consequences of this singular event basically affects every country in the world. In 1996, U.S. forces stationed in Japan and South Korea are withdrawn. The U.S. federal government is running out of money and becoming more and more right-wing and isolationist. At the same time, there's the collapse of the Soviet Union, and so you have a power vacuum in a specific region of the world. This upsets the careful balance in the region between South Korea, Japan, and China. Japan just a year earlier carried out what was known as the Grand Unification of Ministries and Agencies, which essentially shored up the power and political influence of the Arasaka Corporation and right-wing nationalist parties within Japan. We have to remember that the Cyberpunk universe was created before China's meteoric economic rise. And so Japan really remains the sole superpower in the region, not China. And that concerns South Korea because they have a very troubled history of Japan. At one point in time, Korea was a protectorate of Imperial Japan. Now, with both the Soviet Union and America withdrawn from the region, both South and North Korea decide that it's a good time to start the unification process. South Korea has just recently elected some of its first civilian presidents and was now seen as an economic powerhouse and one of the 4 Asian tiger economies. North Korean leader Kim sees the writing on the wall. His own brand of Marxism has failed to keep up with South Korea, and so he wants to take advantage of this power vacuum and global confusion and begins amassing troops on the 38th parallel. No one really knows who fired the first shot, but the Second Korean War begins in 1999. South Korea claims that North Korean airplanes were spotted in South Korean airspace, but no foreign radar can really confirm their findings. China would quietly aid North Korea, and the US would quietly aid South Korea along with Japan. Although secretly, some Japanese officials believe that any kind of turmoil in the Korean peninsula is good for Japan's own national interests. Now, there have been a lot of hypothetical war games about what would happen during a unification war. The 38th parallel has always been known as one of the most heavily militarized borders in the world. The North Koreans mainly depend on a massive conscript army supported by older Soviet-style tanks and aircraft, along with a massive amount of artillery units. To make matters worse, the South Korean capital Seoul, which has a population of 25 million, is only around 30 miles away from the DMZ border, and well within the range of North Korean shells and missiles. Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, is located around 90 miles from the border as well. It's not surprising that the initial fighting in the Second Korean War is amongst the bloodiest fighting humanity has ever seen. Luckily, the North doesn't use their feared nuclear arsenal during the opening salvos. Although Arasaka Corporation does make a killing selling fallout shelters to rich South Koreans. North and South Korea are pretty evenly matched, and 2 years into the war, the South has only managed to seize around 15% of the North's land. Neither side can seem to eliminate each other, but then in 2004, the North Koreans managed to pull off a string of major victories, which really shocks the South Korean military and puts them on the defensive. This ultimately leads to a military coup led by General Lee Ryong-yoon, who overthrows the South Korean civilian government. Yoon and his military junta now switched South Korea's name to Unified Korea. With a renewed energy and support of South Korean armed forces, Young slowly begins turning the tide against the North. The most important move he makes is cutting off Chinese aid and supplies from the North. Once this happens, the North Korean military begins running low on food, fuel, supplies, and ammunition. It's basically the beginning of the end for North Korea. Soon, the North Korean capital Pyongyang is surrounded and besieged, and after 3 days of continuous fighting, the North Korean dictator is toppled and the United Republic of Korea is born. And because this is cyberpunk and it's all chaos, General Yoon gets assassinated like a few days after when a massive bomb gets set off during a press conference. The United Republic of Korea was not the solution the people of the Korean Peninsula wanted. The war was extremely costly, not only in lives and resources, but South Korea's democratic institutions have been completely destroyed in the process of preserving the country's sovereignty during the war. After the assassination of General Yoon, South Korean politics would be dominated by nepotism and heavy corporate influence. The United Republic of Korea's armed forces would actually be remodeled after the US military. And by 2020, United Korea has the second largest economy in the region after Japan. What's interesting about Cyberpunk's Unified Korea is it shows us what can potentially be lost in the event of a second Korean War. While many Koreans on both sides of the DMZ look towards reunification, the cost of a hot war between these two brethren nations could create irreparable damage for the region. It makes us consider the possibility that the status quo might be a better option until better solutions are figured out. And this is why I ultimately really like alternative timelines, especially ones that diverge from our own timeline. I mean, it really helps us gain a little more awareness of what is happening in the world, and in certain cases, it actually makes us appreciate our own more stable timeline than, say, the cyberpunk one, because that is a terrible place and a terrible world to live. I mean, bugs aside, things are just chaotic. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that life is a movie, and you are the protagonist.